This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. The show begins with livestock economist Derrell Peel from Oklahoma State University with a cattle market update. He discusses the stock market shock and how the fundamentals of the cattle market are holding strong. K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth continues today's show as he talks about armyworms and fall armyworms and the current concerning questions he is getting from producers. Sarah Lancaster, K-State weed specialist, ends the show with reminders about handling and control for producers who are using cereal rye on their operation. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with the cattle market update. And this week, we're joined by Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
Derrell, starting off our cattle market conversation with, what is cash looking like?
Well, the cattle markets have had a rough ride the last couple of weeks. After the big stock market shock, that impacted futures in a really big way, both live and feeder cattle futures. And that spills over then pretty quickly into cash markets, especially at this time of the year. And I really think part of the reason why the markets have been impacted as much as they have is because it's still summertime. We've been kind of marking time to get through the heat of the summer. It's not a time when the market has a great deal of sense of direction. So I think it was pretty easy for these external factors to kind of beat up on the market. All of that said, the fundamentals haven't changed. So, we'll be back is sort of the short answer. As we move forward, I think the markets will recover. It may take a while, but we'll see, we'll see this thing come back and sort of get past this.
So also needing to see some recovery in the futures market for cattle?
Yeah, I think so. And the futures market's job is to sort of anticipate the worst case scenario. And obviously it does that very well. So with those external shocks in terms of, global stock market indexes and so on, the futures market reacts immediately to what could happen, dropped sharply. Again, that spills over into cash markets, arguably more than it should. But nevertheless, it's understandable that we would see those impacts. But they're all, kind of anticipatory of what could happen, but not necessarily reflecting the reality of where we are in the marketplace. So somebody described it the other day as the funds versus the fundamentals. And, in the short run, the funds win for a while, but ultimately the fundamentals will prevail.
Derrell, you've mentioned fundamentals a few times. What have been key to surviving this stock market shock?
Well, obviously we're subject to this kind of volatility, and we've had several shocks over the last years. HPAI caused one earlier in the spring. Last fall, we went through a similar market overcorrection, I would call it, but it lasted through much of the fall. And we did come back from it ultimately, but it took a while. And so I think the lesson here is when we're at record high or essentially at record high cattle prices, we're very vulnerable to shocks. And so even though we're still quite bullish in general about cattle markets for the foreseeable future, the rest of this year and next year and beyond, more than likely, but nevertheless, we're subject to these kind of shocks. So it means that producers still really need to think about risk management that would protect them at various points in time when they have to be marketing some cattle. And so anything can happen on any given day, and that can be a really bad thing, even though the market is fundamentally still strong.
What about for box beef cutout? What are we seeing there?
It's interesting through all of this, right? And you can talk about all the problems in the cattle markets generally. Box beef has actually been very steady for the last month or 5 weeks. It's traded in a relatively narrow range. It's actually trying to increase a little bit, which I would expect as we get into the fall. We're probably seeing some late summer buying for Labor Day weekend, getting ready for that last grilling holiday. But, in general, that market has been quite stable through the summer, reflecting, again, an underlying stability in the overall market.
So when we look at the cattle market in the long run, what are you kind of seeing?
We're still on a very bullish path in this cattle market. Numbers are tight. They're going to get tighter at some point, depending on what drought does on the one hand, on what we do in terms of maybe heifer retention to think about herd rebuilding. In the southern plains for the next few weeks, one of the critical factors will be what are the prospects for winter wheat grazing and the prospects for some stocker demand this fall. So all of those kinds of factors and potentially others will be playing into this market, but it's against the backdrop here of tight numbers that are still getting tighter.
And talking about numbers, something important with numbers in the cattle market, Cattle on Feed report came out Friday, August 23rd.
The August Cattle on Feed report came out, the pre-report estimates were for placements to be up somewhat. The average guess was 104% of last year. It actually came in about 106%. So there's a chance that the market will treat that as a little bit bearish. It was kind of on the upper end of the range of expectations there. Marketings came in pretty much as expected, about 108% of last year. The on-feed inventory is virtually unchanged from a year ago, just a few head bigger, so rounds to 100% of last year, which is where we've been for the last 3 months. We've been tracking last year's levels pretty closely through this thing.
So really no big surprises on the Cattle on Feed report?
I don't see it as big surprises. Again, the placement number could be viewed a little bit bearish. One of the things you have to keep in mind is that, and we probably talked about this a month ago, or somebody did, that last month there were 2 less business days in the month compared to the previous year. This month we make up for it. We have 2 extra business days in the month compared to a year ago. So when you look at both the placements and marketings to some extent, although especially the marketings number, you have to adjust it really for the days on, or the business days in the month. And so the marketings rate was actually probably just about equal to a year ago, or perhaps just slightly less. With that 8% increase, that's about equivalent to 2 extra days of work in the month.
Derrell, earlier you mentioned wheat pastures and what you thinking might be happening there as we look into wheat planting. And so as you traveled around Oklahoma, what were you seeing?
There's always interest in grazing wheat in the fall. I mean, producers worry first about if you're interested in forage, getting wheat in late summer. It's always kind of a race in the summer versus summer temperatures, soil moisture conditions. But I can say that as I drove to northwest Oklahoma yesterday, saw an awful lot of farming going on, anhydrous being applied to fields in anticipation of planting. So I think producers are clearly thinking about planting. And at this time of the year, that means they're interested in grazing. We wouldn't be planting, until October probably if we were only interested in grain. So there was a lot of work being done. Now, are we going to have wheat pasture? It's still too early to tell. We're kind of borderline dry, so we'll see how the wheat gets up, and whether we get follow-up rains that will continue to provide development of that wheat so that we have forage later in the year. And then later, there's the question of what do the stocker economics look like? We'll have to visit that later when we get into it and actually look at the numbers as we get a little deeper into the fall.
Could that play into as producers might be thinking about heifer retention?
Heifer retention is an interesting question. We've been anticipating the potential for it for over a year. Still don't have any evidence that it's happening. But, one of the things that we might see is that some of this wheat pasture, for example, if it develops, may get used for heifers that are really not stocker heifers. Technically, they're heifers in development for breeding. So it's hard to tell at this point. I really anticipate that we'll see some indication of heifer retention by the end of the year. So we'll know that with next January's inventory numbers. But honestly, there's no data out there to support that at this point. Heifer slaughter rates, they're down slightly and decreasing slightly, but they're still at high enough levels that would suggest that we're probably still mostly feeding and eating these heifers rather than saving them to go back into the herd.
And when we're thinking about the heifer retention, putting it possibly, we don't know yet, back into herds and just getting those numbers back to what they used to be, but not above, correct?
Yeah, I've spent quite a time studying where we are now compared to the last couple of cattle cycles. One of the things that's very important for producers to be aware of is that we have basically emptied the heifer pipeline over the last 6 years. And so we're starting with nothing, essentially, effectively. And so that means that it's a slow process. If we save a heifer calf in the fall of 24, we can potentially breed her in 25. calves in 26. We're talking late 26 into 2027 before we get any increase in beef production. And so it's a lengthy process, and I think that's very important in terms of how producers' expectations are developing in terms of whether it's worth keeping heifers yet. What we've seen so far is that with the markets we've had in 2023 and 2024, producers have been pretty content to sell pretty much everything they had, including the heifers, and take advantage of the markets. But if the prices are going to be high enough, long enough, then it's worth foregoing selling them now and keeping them for future production. I don't know if we've tipped that corner yet in terms of what producers are looking at, but I think we're going to continue to face that question in the coming months.
So, Derrell, as we look at the cattle market, how have your cattle producers been feeling in Oklahoma?
For the most part, I think producers are pretty happy with things. We've had better forage conditions this year for the most part. Obviously, prices have generally been good unless you got caught in one of these shocks. But for the most part, and prices even at current levels are still at or above year-ago levels. So, it's not like we've got bad markets, just a little bit of a setback recently. I think producers are happy, but again, they've been very cautious relative to how aggressive they're going to be going forward. And I think that's probably a very wise approach because of concerns about how long this market will remain strong, concerns about the cost of financing herd rebuilding, concerns about potential drought redevelopment. All kinds of factors really serve to temper enthusiasm. So we're taking advantage of selling what we have now, but I don't know that we're really getting very aggressive about trying to change the level of production in this industry at this point in time.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show talking about fall armyworms and armyworms with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, sure. My pleasure. Anytime.
Jeff, you've been receiving quite a few questions about these insects, fall armyworms and armyworms.
Every year we have a few problems with either one, armyworms or fall armyworms. Some years we have problems with both at the same time, and that's a little more problematic, of course. The first thing I'd like everybody to know is that they're both voracious feeding larvae, and they feed on about the same kind of crops or the same kind of host food, whatever you want to call it. But generally we consider armyworms more of a grass-type feeder and fall armyworms more of a broadleaf, but they can eat on either one. When they're hungry, they'll eat anything that's growing. And the treatment thresholds, the way we sample for them, is just about the same for either one. And in the last few years, their developmental stages have kind of overlapped pretty much. So when you're out sampling, it doesn't matter a whole lot which species it is in the larval stage that you're sampling for, because they're going to cause basically the same kind of damage per worm. So with that in mind, the fall armyworm, we don't think it overwinters in Kansas. It generally comes into the state from southern overwintering sites. The weather has a lot of impact on when they come in, but generally the first part of June. So the fall armyworm flies in, the adults do. They've mated and they'll lay eggs. Those eggs hatch. And then we have the first fall armyworm larvae feeding. They can feed on whatever's available. The thing is, when they're small, both fall armyworm and armyworm, they're really difficult to find. They hide underneath leaves or they hide in whorls, or depending upon what they're feeding on. But during the day, for the most part, they will go down the bottom of the plant and hide in the leaf litter, especially when it's hot. They're mostly feeding at night because they're mostly nocturnal. If you really want to go out and find the larvae, you got to go out early evening or early in the morning, dig around in the leaf litter, and that makes it a little more challenging. The other way to find them is look for the damage they cause.
What does the damage look like?
When they're first feeding a small larvae, they'll cause what we call window painting on the leaf. The window painting means you really got to get out there and look. It's a hole in a leaf that has not gone all the way through the leaf. I guess that's the best way to explain it. They just scrape off the top part of the leaf, and you can tell it's been fed upon, and it'll be kind of a long diagonal line or along the veins or something. They don't eat the whole leaf. They don't take a big bite out of the leaf until they get a little older. And once they get older, they'll start eating on the leaf material, and that's basically what they feed on. And that's when we recommend you get out and start looking, is when somebody starts telling you or you hear that the fall armyworm moths are flying back into the state, that's a good time to get out and start looking. There are also pheromone traps available if you're interested in actually putting out traps for fall armyworms or armyworms. There are pheromones available which attract males. So you put those around whatever field or crop that you're interested in. They will indicate or they will trap the first arrivals of the first moths when they come into the state. The problem with those, we've never been able to correlate infestation in a field with the trap catch. So they're really good for indicating when the adults are flying, because that means there'll be eggs deposited someplace in the area. We've just never been able to, and we've tried. They are good for detecting when the moths are flying, because that's when the eggs are laid. So once that happens, you can go out and start looking for the early instar larvae or the small larvae, because that's the time you want to catch them. And there are several different sampling methods that you can use depending upon the crop, depending upon the time of year and all that kind of stuff. So the fall armyworm comes in usually in June, but the armyworm can and usually does overwinter in Kansas. So usually if you have a problem in early February, maybe if it got warm temperatures, or in March, if you've got some wheat that's having some problems, or you have some early seeded brome, that's probably going to be an armyworm, because they've overwintered in Kansas and they come out a little bit earlier. Those early arrivals, whether they're fall armyworms or armyworm adults, those generally are the ones that they'll mate and they'll lay eggs. The next generation will be a little bit larger.
How many generations do we usually see?
So every year is a little bit different, but we have multiple generations. We'll have 2, 3, or 4 generations a year, depending upon the weather. And each generation, for the most part, will be a little bit larger than the previous generation, because there's more of them, they lay more eggs, all that kind of stuff. So they build upon themselves. So that's why early on you can see a little damage, but then, the next generation comes around, you may see more, and the next generation more, that kind of thing. As the larvae, as the worms feed, as they get larger, they do more damage. I mean, that's just the way insects work. And they're feeding 24/7. The larvae will feed, actually cause damage in the summer for about 2 weeks. Early spring, it may take them a little longer if it's cool. Late summer, early fall, it may take them a little longer because it's cool. But generally from now, it's August to mid-September, early October, it will take them 2 weeks to feed. So if you're out looking now, and the calls I've been getting lately are in brome, because they, in the last few years, especially in eastern Kansas, they've decimated some brome fields. The main question I get is, if you have an armyworm infestation in your brome now, and they're 1 inch long, which is generally armyworm, fall armyworm larvae. If they're an inch and a quarter in length, they're probably not going to feed much longer. They're probably about at the end of their feeding cycle, so they're going to crawl down into the soil and pupate. They don't feed while they're pupating. They'll pupate for, 4 or 5 days. They will come out as an adult. They will start mating. They will start ovipositing or laying eggs. They'll deposit these eggs wherever they're attracted, whatever's green. If you just planted your wheat in September, they'll go to a wheat field. If you have some green brome out there or your yard, because they're looking for succulent matter for those larvae to feed upon. Mid-September, late September, it's going to be questionable whether we have another generation or not. If it stays warm like it has in the last several years, clear up into November, we'll have another generation or two. The fall armyworm adults will pack up and go south for the winter. Armyworms, not. They'll stay here, and they will keep producing eggs, until we get a killing frost. And by that I mean it gets down into the 20s for a couple of hours. That will take care of the problem. But they have, in the past years, decimated wheat fields or partial wheat fields. If they come out of brome, the brome's matured and gotten pretty brown, so there's no more succulent vegetation, so the adult moths will fly to the wheat, and they'll lay eggs in wheat. Now, if you've got a fall seeded brome field where it's, nice and green, succulent, they'll fly to that and lay eggs in that also. The question I get now is if they're an inch long or so, should I spray? No, do not. They're about through feeding. If you spray now, the insecticides that we commonly use, and remember they're contact insecticides, so gallonage is important. You want to use enough water to get it to where the insects are. They're going to be finished feeding soon, if not already. They're going to crawl down to the base of the plant. They're going to pupate, and it's going to be another 2 or 3 weeks before there are any eggs produced. The other question that I get, if I have an infestation in my field right now and I don't spray it, are there going to be in that, is the next generation going to be in that field also? And that's some, again, we have not been able to correlate. Generally, those moths move and they have to fly someplace to mate. So generally they fly someplace, they fly around and they mate, and then they will be attracted to wherever there's succulent green tissue to oviposit on and have their larvae grow on. So just because they're in this field now doesn't mean that next generation is going to be there.
Where can people find out more information on control for these?
Go to our KSU insect management guides, right? For treatment thresholds, depending upon the crop, they're not well established for brome or for pastures, just because there has not been a lot of research conducted. But if you go to the K-State Extension Entomology website and click on crops and click on efficacy trials, we did conduct a insecticide efficacy trials probably 2 or 3 or 4 years ago on brome for armyworms. So there are some insecticides that we tried, that we used. You can get an idea of which ones worked and which ones didn't if you go to that. There are a lot of insecticides that are registered for armyworms or fall armyworms, but not all of them are effective. There's some that are registered, and they have been registered for 30 years, but we wouldn't recommend them. So what I really recommend doing is going to the website and check out the products that we tested. That doesn't mean those are the only ones that work. That's just the ones we pulled out that were labeled, that were commonly available, and they happened to work. So I really recommend that. But armyworms have been a real problem. They are a real problem this year in brome. They might be in wheat once we start planting wheat again. And also just remember, it's a good time to get rid of your volunteer wheat 2 weeks before you plant your crop, because the armyworms, they don't care if it's volunteer wheat or domestic, whether you plant it or not. If there's a nice lush crop of volunteer wheat, the female moths will lay eggs there, and if that volunteer's there and those eggs are there when your planted wheat comes up, they'll be happy to feed on that also. So
that was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking about cereal rye with K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation, Shelby.
Sarah, why is cereal rye something we need to think about when it comes to wheat?
So, Shelby, like a lot of our most troublesome weeds in wheat, cereal rye has a very similar life cycle and very similar growth habit to wheat. Historically, it has been one of the big problems for our wheat producers. The reason that it's on my mind at the moment is because we have a lot of potential for increasing the amount of cereal rye we find in wheat if we're not very conscientious about how we're handling some of our cover crops. We've talked about cover crops on Ag Today before. Cereal rye, if you're looking for a cover crop to control weeds ahead of something like soybeans, it's one of the best. But it has this kind of other side of the coin that we need to just be aware of.
And it has a little bit of a similar look to wheat, so how can people distinguish the differences?
Yeah, so wheat and cereal rye are similar. They're both winter cereal grains. When they're small, they're going to look very, very similar. As they mature, it becomes easier. Cereal rye generally is going to be sticking out above the wheat canopy. It's a little taller. And the heads are typically longer and skinnier, as are the grains, right? It's just a little bit taller and thinner just in general. Other things to think about as you look at the ligule, cereal rye will not have hairs around the ligule. And cereal rye does not have auricles. So wheat has those kind of ear-like auricles sticking out at the collar region, and cereal rye does not have that. So until they joint and head, you might have to look a little bit closer.
So if you're not able to prevent it being in your field, or something accidentally happens and it ends up in your field, how do you control it?
Well, there's not a lot of options for chemical control once the wheat and the rye have come up, unless you're in a herbicide-resistant wheat system. So, to me, that means we've got to be looking ahead and knowing where we've had the problems, and maybe knowing, what the neighbors are up to, that kind of thing. And thinking about maybe some of those herbicide-tolerant wheat varieties. So the two that come to mind, the older ones would be the Clearfield varieties, right? So we can use Beyond on those. The other option that's a little bit newer would be coaxium wheat varieties, and we can use the herbicide Aggressor to control non-wheat grasses in those coaxium wheat varieties. So really, I recently fielded a call from an agent on this very question, and really the answer is, for chemical control, the best thing is just to use those herbicide-resistant wheat varieties. I know they come with some extra costs, but it's the options that we have. There's been older research looking at things like planting density of wheat and some things like that, but there's nothing that's going to be as effective as the herbicides in those resistant varieties, or the good old-fashioned hand roguing, which everybody really appreciates.
So, Sarah, when it comes to cereal rye, really working to prevent it, so hopefully you don't have to deal with it?
Really, I think that's the thing to keep in mind. And so I guess that's why it's on my mind this time of year. It's just as we move towards thinking about planting those cover crops, just being mindful of drill, clean out. One of the places anecdotally that I've seen this is spreading fertilizer with, maybe the truck had previously been used for spreading cereal rye, and then we spread fertilizer, and so we spread rye with our fertilizer, that kind of thing. So just being very cognizant of kind of crossing your T's and dotting your I's when you're cleaning out equipment is probably the best thing to do this time of year.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure.
That was K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. You can read more on this topic by checking out a recent Agronomy E-Update article titled Cereal Rye Control in Wheat. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can find it for yourself by going to eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Again, that is eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. This article is in the August 15th E-Update. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Tuesday.